Welcome to Crash Course English Literature, and this is for The Life of Laetitia by Merle Hodge and the poems Mirror and Old Higue by Sylvia Plath and Mark McWatt. Firstly, a short overview of the novel For the Life of Laetitia. The book is set in 1993 Trinidad and follows the story of a young girl, Laetitia Johnson. Her life changes drastically when she moves from her home to live with her father in the city. Through Laetitia's experiences, we see her growth and development as she navigates high school. To further analyze the book, we'll begin with chapter summaries. The book begins with the readers getting a glimpse into Laetitia's life, especially the straining relationship between her and her father. During their conversations as they traveled, it was clear that Laetitia was very studious and enjoyed reading. From this chapter, we also get to know that she was accepted into the government secondary school. In chapter 2, the strain in the relationship between Laetitia and her father is emphasized. The first sentence of the chapter narrates, "I had never seen much of my father before this." It was evident also that Ma, her grandmother, did not have a positive opinion of him, as he was very absent in her upbringing until she'd achieved something monumental. In the end of the chapter, it appeared as if Mr. Cephas wanted Laetitia to move and stay with him in the city La Puerta. In chapter 3, Papi, Laetitia's grandfather, made a biblical reference. There comes a time in every man's life where he repenteth for the evil he hath done. This was applicable to Mr. Cephas, who was now regretting his lack of involvement in Laetitia's life. Also in this chapter, we were introduced to Mammy Patsy, Laetitia's mother, who lived in New York. She wrote a letter wanting her daughter to be treated well if she were to be sent to live with her father and his wife in the city. Chapter 4 begins with Ma taking Laetitia to register for her new school. During this, Miss Lopez, a teacher at the secondary school who was described as a circus horse, was disgusted by the pair as Laetitia and her father did not have the same last names. This caused a dispute between her and Ma. Fortunately, this was resolved quickly. After, they went to visit Ma Zeline, Mammy Patsy's godmother. Ma and Zeline gossiped about the incident that took place at the school. Here it was revealed that Ma Zeline did not have any kids and had no wishes for any. In chapter 5, Lacey's father arrived a week prior to the opening of school. Her uncle Leroy said to her, however, that she wasn't going anywhere unless she cleaned up the garden. Lacey and her cousin Charlene, along with her siblings Ruth and Kenwin, worked together to get the job done early in the morning. Her uncle Leroy had proposed that she take some of her produce from her little farm to her father in the city. It was ruled out, however, that she could not take bhaji, as it was poor people's food, so she could only take okras that was more suitable for high-class people like Mr. Cephas. At the beginning of chapter 6, Lacey expresses her satisfaction that the long and uneasy drive with her father to La Puerta is over. It is likely that Lacey's discomfort stemmed from not having Mr. Cephas as a staple in her life. In this chapter, we are also introduced to Mr. Cephas's wife, Miss Velma. In her description, it is said that she looks sad, aged, and sorrowful. Miss Velma's appearance is most likely due to her son's Michael disobedience and the demanding personality of her husband. Michael is characterized as a very untidy individual who mocks Lacey and renamed her Lettice. In the chapter, Lacey narrates that nobody living under the same roof as Ma could walk away and leave their bed in such a state. You wouldn't dream of it. In this chapter, Miss Velma is shown to be patient, waiting for Mr. Cephas's arrival and rising only when she realized he would not come. Lacey exaggerated how slowly he walked, comparing her to her grandmother. When morning came, Miss Velma wanted to bring Lacey to church with her. She was careful to be quiet in the drawing room so she would not wake Mr. Cephas or Michael, demonstrating her consideration for them. Miss Velma also turned her radio down to the lowest volume in order to listen to the Sunday theater without disturbing Mr. Cephas. Lastly, Mr. Cephas's pride was evident when he invited his friends over to show off Lacey and her intelligence, introducing her as a little scholar who could be smarter than the Prime Minister. In chapter 8, Lacey and Miss Velma went around the city to get what Lacey needed for school. During this time, Miss Velma also helped Lacey get acquainted with the city so she could be comfortable traveling to and from school. Furthermore, Lacey attempted to instill some manners and principles into Michael, who had been disrespectful previously. She warned him that she would pinch him if he called Miss Velma again and instructed him to refer to her as Lacey. Lacey also taught Michael how to make his bed properly and then ordered him to take a bath prior to going to bed. In chapter 9, Lacey is introduced to her classmate Anjanae, whose jovial personality is compared to that of Charlene's mother, Tara. Anjanae is embarrassed to take her lunch out of her brown parcel as she fears being mocked for having what she perceives as poor people food. Lacey attempts to make her feel better by praising the food, claiming that it is one of the best lunches. Also in this chapter, we can see where the two girls get further acquainted. In chapter 10, Anjanae arrives late to school and is ashamed as a result. Lacey notices her head on the desk and worries she's unwell, but Anjanae tries to hide her exhaustion by acting jovial. When Anjanae was spotted by Laetitia with no geography book on her desk, Lacey offered to share hers. Each class they had after that, Anjanae had no book. At break, however, she said to Lacey in a rush that she was getting the rest of her books next week. In an attempt to lighten the dull mood, Lacey teases Miss Lopez, comparing her to a circus horse. There was heavy rain the next morning, and many children were late, among them Anjanae. By lunchtime, the rain had stopped, but it was too wet outside to eat, so Anjanae found them a new spot, a space behind the lockers where abandoned, broken furniture was stored. Anjanae did not take out her lunch to eat as many students came by the lockers at lunchtime. In chapter 11, Lacey's suspicions increased as she realized that Anjanae was absent from school and also felt lost without her. In Lacey's social studies class, her teacher questioned why Lacey's drawing showed an extended family instead of a husband and a wife. She made a reference to her family being like the old woman who lived in an old shoe, implying that they were poor and living in cramped conditions. This was seen as disrespectful since the poem is about a woman with many children who is living in poverty. In chapter 12, it is evident how delighted Lacey is to be heading home to her family in so-called Trace. As she and Anjanae walked down to the bus station, Anjanae seemed to be in a bad mood, answering Lacey in a monotonous tone and showing heavy footsteps. Although Lacey is happy, she is worried about Anjanae, who appears to be unwell. Anjanae swiftly brushed off Lacey's worries by shaking her head to indicate that she is alright. Later, Anjanae told Lacey that her family do not want her to even leave the house when Lacey asked if she had any relatives in the town to stay with. She and her father and brothers thought schooling was pointless for her as she knew how to do basic things such as reading, writing, cooking, and washing. This made Lacey emotional on her way to school Trace as it made her think of Anjanae's plight. When she finally arrived at Junction, she joyfully greeted everyone, feeling proud of herself. As she approached her home, she was welcomed by her family, who had obviously missed her. Her family inquired about her father, wanting to make sure he was treating her right in La Plata. In chapter 13, the book goes on to demonstrate how underprivileged Anjanae is. She can only afford to wear one shirt that has ink stains on it and is tight-lipped when questioned by Lacey. After some convincing, Anjanae reveals her home life. Her brothers and father refuse to give her taxi fare and makes her stay home and help her mother, who works tirelessly and is not appreciated by her father nor her brothers. To make ends meet, Anjanae goes out early and returns late at night, picking vegetables to sell around the village. This eventually leads to her becoming ill. Despite her situation, Anjanae is determined not to end up like her mother and is determined to have a better life. In chapter 14, it is demonstrated that Mr. Cephas attempted to instill discipline in Michael by hitting him when he had difficulty with his schoolwork. This enraged his father, who was disappointed that Michael was not as smart as he wanted him to be. Miss Velma consistently tried to shield Michael from this discipline. It was also revealed that Mr. Cephas took a great interest in Lacey's education and that his outlook was misguided. He married Miss Velma only because he thought it would increase his social standing, but in reality, Miss Velma was oppressed by Mr. Cephas. In chapter 15, we witness Lacey receiving a letter from her mother detailing her plans to attend 9 classes and earn her high school diploma since Laetitia's father was now helping to pay for her schooling. Despite the difficulties she faces, such as having to leave her job at the hospital at 5 or 6 o'clock, eat a quick sandwich and rush to catch a train to class, she persists, and her teacher has a lot of sympathy towards her, helping her to understand the material better. Although she often feels overwhelmed, She remains determined, knowing that as long as everyone is okay, she can continue fighting. Ma is often seen clutching the letters from Mommy Patsy, often smiling on and on. Additionally, Lacey tries to go with Ma to Junction to sell her goods and Ma refuses, wanting Lacey to stay focused on her studies and instead enlisting the help of Carlisle. Chapter 16 introduces to us Doreen Sandiford and her crew, who are particularly rowdy and disobeys the school rules such as going to the La Puerta shopping plaza. Further on, we see a clash between Lacey and Mrs. Lopez, who scolds Anjani for not understanding the lesson. Lacey attempts to help Anjani understand, but Mrs. Lopez interrupts them, telling them to stop the talking in her class. Lacey retorted, saying that Anjani still did not understand, which fueled an argument between the two. Mrs. Lopez became even more disrespectful and rude, insulting them by saying that some of them did not even have parents and comparing them to pigs before leaving. In chapter 17, Marlon and his gang were reprimanded for playing a trick on a classmate, and all were punished except the Indian boys. This caused an uproar in the class. The apparent unfairness of this decision, that only Marlon was being punished, was seen as discriminatory by many and was seen as racism. In chapter 18, it is seen that Michael became a completely different person, showing more motivation to clean, such as sweeping his room and also reading his books. This enraged Mr. Cephas, as he claims that Michael was doing something he perceived to be a woman's job, and told him to tell Miss Vilma to go to hell if she asked him to do it again. Also in this chapter, we see where Miss Vilma showed Lacey a picture of her from high school days, which depicted her as a jovial and lively person, but in her wedding picture, she looked more reserved. Additionally, society's stereotypical gender roles were highlighted in this chapter. This is seen when Miss Velma states that she was taken out of school so her brother could receive an education, since it was seen as more important for boys to have one. As a result, she was sent to learn sewing at a shirt factory where she met Mr. Cephas. After their conversation, Miss Velma's cheerful demeanor evaporated, and she began to sort and iron clothes for both Michael and Mr. Cephas. When Lacey attempted to help, she was told it was Miss Velma's job and that she should be studying her books. This exemplifies the traditional image of women as homewives and men as the head of the household. In chapter 19, it is observed that everyone was kind and supportive to Anjani because of her friendly nature. They often helped her out by sharing books and giving her pages from their own books. Unfortunately, Anjani's health took a turn for the worse one day when she fainted in PE class. Marlon and Ashad ran to get her some water. Mrs. Lopez often targeted Anjani, questioning her on topics she knows she didn't know, making sarcastic comments and writing hurtful sentences like hopeless on her paper. It was also seen that Anjani stopped attending school for a while, which made Lacey become worried. Mrs. Lopez's behavior led to an outburst from the class when she said, "That's one less dunce in my class." One girl even came up to her desk and swept everything off. Mrs. Lopez quickly grabbed her belongings and said she was going to the principal, but the principal never showed. At the start of chapter 20, the students had a dispute with their Spanish teacher, and Mrs. Hafiz, their form teacher, spoke to them about their conduct. Doreen Sandiford then shouted out, in a loud and raspy voice, that said Spanish teacher, Mr. Terwari, was racist, implying that people of color were like black chickens. Miss Hafiz then warned the students about the seriousness of racism and how it should not be taken lightly. In chapter 21, the readers see where Laetitia was prohibited from visiting her family in so-called Trace by her father during the midterm break, so she considered many ideas to make it to La Puerta. Initially, Lacey wanted to go to the city to ask Mazaline for funds, but worried that Ma would be angry with her for asking for money. She also thought of pleading her case to Miss Vilma, but stopped herself, seemingly knowing that Miss Vilma was scared of Mr. Cephas. She decided to just spend time with Mazaline instead. Mazaline was very passionate about not having children, and even fought someone who made fun of her for not having any. Lacey realized that she could not compare her difficult situation to Anjani's, as Anjani had not attended many classes and midterm break was soon approaching, and she was not prepared for any of the material. In chapter 22, Laetitia was taken aback when her father, Mr. Cephas, returned home earlier than expected. She realized that he had come home to make sure she wasn't going to visit her family. That day, he spent the whole evening at home, a change from his usual routine. The next morning, Laetitia got up and began her chores. Mr. Cephas woke up to check if she had left, and when he saw she was still there, he sat and ate his breakfast. As he ate, he questioned why he should feed and clothe Michael if he is not going to do anything to deserve it. After the hostile conversation, he left again, leaving Laetitia free to go and see Marceline. In chapter 23, Laetitia visits Marceline and expresses her difficulties with Mr. Cephas, her teachers, and her peers. Marceline's response is tender and sympathetic, but she is confident that Laetitia will eventually make her father and brother regret how they treated her. Marceline suggested that Laetitia come to see her on the weekends when she cannot be with her family, though Laetitia is unsure if this agreement would be agreeable with Mr. Cephas. Shortly after their conversation, Laetitia explains to Marceline that she wants to get home before Mr. Cephas does, but Marceline convinced her to stay longer and then prepared food for the both of them. After learning that Mama Patsy is studying to get her high school diploma, Marceline encourages Laetitia to make the most of her education and also tells her not to squander the opportunity she has been given. In chapter 24, Anjani and Lacey arrive late to school for their Spanish midterm test. Lacey had an advantage as the teacher, Mr. Tawari, was distracted by a news article. During break, Anjani's sickness was more noticeable as she vomited in the drain. When they got back to the classroom, they were 5 minutes late and Mrs. Lopez questioned them for their tardiness. Lacey explained that Anjani wasn't feeling well. Anjani's face went pale and she started to shake. This placed Lacey at a disadvantage as Miss Lopez watched them closely, making it impossible for Lacey to help Anjani during the test. A week later, Mrs. Lopez handed out the results and was angry with most of them for not passing. She criticized them for being there, saying that secondary school was for people with brains. She then called out Anjani's grade, embarrassingly asking why she came to school instead of staying home and making garden. After that, Mrs. Lopez praised Laetitia's grade, 98%, and asked to talk to her privately. However, Laetitia made it clear that she did not want to be her friend. In chapter 25, Mr. Cephas came home earlier than usual again, trying to find a reason to be mad at Laetitia, but she didn't show any emotion in response. He then got mad at Lacey for saying good evening and not addressing him by his title. Laetitia then corrected herself and called him father. He continued to look for an excuse to get upset with Laetitia, and finally he noticed that Lacey was reading a storybook in her room instead of helping Miss Velma in the kitchen, which prompted him to ask if she was going to be a worthless woman. Lacey's slim face stared at him in response. After Mr. Cephas's rant about the house not being a hotel and her going to visit her family over the weekend, he attempted to smile and ask if she was finished reading the book. In chapter 26, the reader sees where Laetitia complains that no one, Ma nor Uncle Leroy, had come to rescue her. Her father tried fruitlessly to initiate conversation. The following week, Laetitia deliberately fails her math assignments just to drown the circus horse in misery. Anjani was in a worse state than ever, Lacey said. She had headaches all day long and failed all her midterm tests. Anjani wanted to drop out, but Laetitia encouraged her and started to do afternoon lessons with her. Miss Velma was not comfortable with this arrangement, and she pleaded with Lacey to be careful. In chapter 27, Laetitia still wanted to go home to Sucral Trace, but Mr. Cephas would not give her the fare. She wrote to Ma, to which Ma replied that she had stashed away bus fare for emergencies. Lacey began to act out immediately. She handed in blank worksheets and joined forces with the troublemakers of her class just to go home. One evening, Laetitia got home and got in trouble with her father for lingering by the bus stop with Anjani. He was revolted at his daughter for being friends with a coolie. Verbally, he tried to discipline her. In chapter 28, the pressure that Lacey faced was recognized. In this chapter, Lacey openly agrees with herself that she has had enough of her life living with her father. She also sat attentively looking and examining the scenes happening in the household. It was recognized how abusive Mr. Cephas had become due to his unspeakable behavior toward his family. It was also highlighted how after experiencing difficulties at school, Laetitia is miserable at home. However, she still tries to excel. In chapter 29, we saw how the entire mood of the chapter lightened due to the Christmas season. In this chapter, we see where Lacey makes up her mind that she would not be returning to her father for Christmas. However, she did not tell him. Further, the readers see where Michael makes a change in himself by showing affection to Lacey by hugging her when he found out that she will be leaving and not staying with them for the holiday season. We also get to see in this chapter where Lacey was sad or a bit bummed out when she found out that Anthony had gotten her period and she hadn't gotten hers. Ending the school year in chapter 29, a class party was held to send off the children for Christmas break. During the car ride back to Sukal Trace in chapter 30, Laetitia, Michael, and Mr. Cephas sat in an uncomfortable silence. Michael could be heard mumbling to himself and occasionally glancing at his father. But Mr. Cephas did not give much attention to the two and seemed to be in a rush to complete the journey. Laetitia was unfamiliar with her home upon their arrival and noticed that the walls were mildewed and felt as if the bathroom and latrine had shifted further away from the house. Additionally, her siblings had grown taller and she found that her own strength had decreased as she could only carry one water bucket at a time. Carlyle was overjoyed to see Laetitia, since he had to do extra work in place of her absence. With Christmas around the corner, the family began their preparations by dusting, cobwebbing, scrubbing, and polishing the house. Ma gathered her brass and lined them up in the gallery, which filled the house with the scent of Christmas. Laetitia attempted to tell Ma that she wanted to move back to Sukal Trace, but she was shut down and told to talk to Papi, who would likely give the same answer. Laetitia felt stuck and knew she would have to return to La Puerta soon. Chapter 31 of Laetitia's story details the flurry of activities her family undertook in preparation for Christmas. Uncle Jamesy, Carlyle, Carlyle's brother, Jennifer, Junior, and Anthony helped Ma with the house. They dusted, scrubbed mattresses, pulled out pillows in the sun, trimmed sunflowers, weeded the yards, and swept the yard until it was bald. Then Uncle Leroy painted the front steps a dark red color as the children observed with amusement. Afterward, the family stripped down the drawing room and organized it for Christmas Eve. All their hard work paid off as the house was completely transformed and beautiful. Despite the hectic pace of the preparations, Ma was in a good mood. Though there were occasional squabbles between the children, the adults opened the Christmas barrel from Mommy Patsy and sorted out what they needed. As a final touch, Uncle Leroy gave the children some worm oil, much to their chagrin. Later in the day, they ate coconut bake with smoked herring and began chukka. Finally, Ma set off to visit Marceline. Chapter 32 focuses on the family coming together to celebrate Christmas. Everyone is preparing for the festivities and eagerly anticipating the arrival of Ma and Charlene. This part of the novel is full of special moments that bring the narrator and her extended family closer together. In this chapter, Lacey comes to the realization that she must return to Mr. Cephas's house in order for her mother to stay in school. Ma explains to Lacey that if she does not go back, Mommy Patsy will have to drop out of school due to the lack of financial support from Mr. Cephas. Lacey's understanding of the situation leads her to reconsider her original stance and accept that she must return. At the beginning of chapter 34 of For the Life of Laetitia, Mr. Cephas went to Laetitia's house in Balatier to pick her up after the Christmas holidays. Upon his arrival, Mr. Cephas's weak and cowardly personality was revealed, which was a stark contrast to the strong, powerful character he usually portrays at home. Laetitia's grandparents were displeased by his presence, and Mr. Johnson, Laetitia's grandfather, scolded him for his lack of involvement as a father. He told him to fulfill his atonement with honor before leaving. The atmosphere remained tense when Mr. Cephas was around Laetitia's grandmother, but he only started to relax once he had driven away from Balatier. Mr. Cephas scolded Laetitia for the callous treatment he had received and described her home as a whole and indecent. He criticized the coolie and half-naked children who lived there and called them backward people with no ambition. He declared that even though Laetitia had a higher education than him, she still needed to learn to respect him. In chapter 35, Lacey returned to La Puerta after the holidays. Miss Velma was noticeably colder towards her. She no longer invited her to church as she used to, and Miss Velma refused to make eye contact. Miss Velma disclosed that her Christmas had been far from enjoyable, telling Laetitia, "Your daddy wasn't too pleased that you didn't stay here for Christmas. He just kept his head in his hands." Fortunately, Lacey's brother Michael was delighted to see her again, having rushed to bathe in anticipation of her visit. He also asked her to read to him before bedtime. In chapter 36, the readers see where school resumed and Anjani was absent, leaving Laetitia unable to function without her friend. Consequently, she skipped classes and ruminated over her father's death. Anjani did not come back for the rest of the week, so Laetitia joined Doreen Sandiford and her clique for lunch. Laetitia described Anjani's return to school as like a ghost sliding through the door. Even while ill, Anjani was still obligated to work. In chapter 37, we see where, as the days passed, Anjani's situation does not improve. She began to fall behind in her studies and soon stopped eating due to the stress of having so much work to do at home. Lacey asked her if her brothers could help, but Anjani just sighed and said, "You know, Lacey, I see myself just washing clothes, cooking food, and sweeping the house all the time, just like my mother." It seemed as if Anjani had given up on her future, believing that she would end up just like her mother, doing housework all day. Lacey tried to encourage her to stay in school, despite her father's opinion, and even suggested that they both skip Mr. Tewari's class. Anjani turned her down, so Lacey would accompany her to the bus station on some afternoons, even if it meant risking being seen by Mr. Cephas. In chapter 38, Laetitia's academic performance has quickly deteriorated. She is skipping classes and not doing her homework, and her grades are plummeting. She has also made friends with a group of disruptive girls. Laetitia is determined to defy Mr. Cephas, yet not disappoints her grandmother. At the conclusion of the chapter, Laetitia is seen walking towards an area of the school which is strictly off limits. In chapter 39, Laetitia recounts starting her adventure at La Puerta Shopping Plaza by sneaking away from school with Doreen Sandiford's group. They managed to get through a gap in the fence and reach the place that they weren't supposed to be. Unfortunately, their escapade was soon interrupted by Mr. Tewari. Despite this, Doreen went back there anyway to purchase her chicken and chips. In chapter 40, Laetitia and the other girls had been apprehended and were facing a 1-week suspension. Laetitia was in a state of panic as she was unsure of how to break the news to her mother. In accordance with the school's rules, a parent or guardian had to take her to the school to resolve the suspension. Laetitia was against the idea of either her father or grandmother accompanying her and instead decided to take the letter to Miss Velma. Miss Velma was taken aback when she read the letter, but Laetitia managed to calm her down and ultimately convinced her to go to the school. In chapter 41, the reader observes Miss Velma's decision to keep Lacey's secret from Mr. Cephas. As the days went by, the two of them became increasingly worried that he would return home. On the third day, his car suddenly arrived at lunchtime, and he was very angry that nobody had informed him of Lacey's suspension. Mr. Cephas demanded an explanation, and Miss Velma reluctantly revealed the truth. After he left, she told Lacey that she wasn't against her, but that she didn't want her around because it made her father's temper even worse. In chapter 42, the suspended students were back in class 2 days prior to midterms, and Lacey was overwhelmed by the exams that she had to take after being absent for so long. She felt ashamed and worried about the grades that she would have to show her family. The chapter concluded with Laetitia sharing that she had decided not to attend the carnival. In chapter 43, when they got back to school after the carnival, Anjani was concerned about Laetitia, hoping she would be able to make up for the lost time in her studies. Anjani, however, was the one with the real problem. Her shirt had become faded and had holes in it. She looked as if she was fading away. On the following Monday, in the middle of the school assembly, Anjani suddenly collapsed and was quickly taken away. In chapter 44, we observe Laetitia's distress over Anjani, who has been absent from school for an entire week. Her preoccupation with her friend is so severe that she is unable to focus on her math class. Mrs. Lopez suggested that if she was so concerned, she should go look for Anjani, and also said to Laetitia, "When you play with dog, you get fleas," to which Laetitia replies with the retort, "Your mother must be the dog," which earns her a trip to the principal's office. The tension in the classroom is broken by a commotion outside, which is caused by the news of Anjani drinking poison. In chapter 45, Laetitia is so overwhelmed by the news of Anjani's death that she is unable to remain at school. Miss Velma gives her medicine for her belly pains when she returns home, which Laetitia believes are the result of her letting down Anjani as a friend. When she sees a bright pink stain on the chair she was sitting in, Laetitia realizes that it is her period and that she will not have the opportunity to share this news with Anjani. The emotion of this causes Lacey to pass out from the overwhelming news. In chapter 46, it is evident that Lacey didn't start going into the yard again until Easter. This gives the impression that she was trying to heal her emotional wounds at La Puerta, as she was obviously in a depressed state when she returned from the hospital. At her home in Balatier, she'd just lay in the bed all the time and was not her usual self. Eventually, she was able to get back on her feet and resume her regular activities. In the final chapter 47, Lacey was happy to be back in the world. She resumed her usual activities, no longer feeling weak or ill, and laughed so heartily at her uncle's jokes that her grandmother declared her to be alive. It was also revealed in this last chapter that Mr. Cephas would still pay for Lacey's school uniform and books, but not her food or transportation. Despite this, Lacey still had dreams about Anjani. A Thanksgiving feast was held, and Ma fed the whole of Sukal trays. To finish off, Laetitia was no longer staying with her father, but back in her home at Balatier. These are prominent themes that were seen throughout the novel for the life of Laetitia. First, poverty. The book makes it clear that poverty is a major theme, as evidenced by Laetitia's and Anjani's experiences. In the first chapter, Laetitia describes her neighborhood, which includes people drawing water from barrels by the side of the road and washing clothes or bathing. Throughout the novel, Anjani also shows signs of poverty, such as when she is embarrassed to show her lunch because of its simplicity, when she has only one shirt with an ink stain on it, and when her shirt starts to become worn and tattered. The next theme is depression. Both Laetitia and Anjani display signs of depression throughout the novel. Laetitia is seen to be struggling with depression in chapter 46 when she is in the hospital and then returns home, where she stays in her room all day and night, hardly eating or speaking to anyone. Meanwhile, Anjani's depression is seen to become more prominent as the story progresses. This is illustrated in chapter 24 when she becomes sick because she is unprepared for her math test, in chapter 19 when she faints in PE class, in chapter 43 when she collapses during the General Assembly, and in chapter 44 when it is revealed that she has drunk poison and died. Another theme that was very prominent in the novel was family relationships. This theme is highly evident from the start of the novel as we observe Laetitia's strained relationship with her father, who was absent for much of her upbringing but has returned to be in her life after a major accomplishment. Similarly, Anjani's family is dismissive and negative towards her, expecting her to follow in her mother's footsteps and take on the same domestic tasks without any recognition for her efforts. Michael, too, is scared of his father's aggressive tendencies, and all of these familial relationships are fraught with tension. The next theme is friendship. This theme is seen all throughout the novel as we get an insight on the relationship between Laetitia and Anjani. They were seen to be very close friends. A lot of Anjani's internal conflict was revealed through their conversations as friends. This proved that their friendship was very close-knit. The settings of the novel were Sukal Trace Balatier. This is where Lacey and her family resides. La Puerta. This is where Lacey's father, his family, and Mazaline resides, and this is also where the government secondary school is located. The last setting was Orangefield. This was where Anjani lived. Some of the conflicts in the novel were the ongoing feud between Mrs. Lopez and Lacey, the disagreement between Ma and Mrs. Lopez, and the disagreement that arose between Mr. Tawari and the class when they noticed his unfair treatment of Marlon Peters. These are some of the dramatic/narrative techniques used in the novel. Firstly, foreshadowing. This is seen when Ma was questioning Laetitia's father's intent of her, coming to live with him in chapter 2. She mentions some of the things that happened further on in the story, such as him ensuring that Lacey did not run wild in the town and get into trouble like so many other secondary students. While reading the story, it is discovered how troublesome Laetitia became. Situations such as her back answering her teachers and also going against the school rules with other students who were disobedient. The other is backstory. Backstory was highlighted where Miss Velma was telling Laetitia about her past. Miss Velma revealed that she was once attending secondary school but had to drop out as her brother's chance at an education was more significant. She began to work at a shirt factory where she met Mr. Cephas. The backstory was also evident when Ma told us what Mammy Patsy and Uncle Leroy wanted to become. Mammy Patsy wanted to become a dentist, while Uncle Leroy wanted to become an airplane mechanic. Next are the dramatic techniques. A dramatic technique used in the novel was characterization. This was used throughout the novel to show the development of each character and their traits and personalities. An example of this is Anjani. She was described as a very poor person who was always tired but always possessed a very jovial personality. Next in this course, we'll be analyzing 2 poems. First is Mirror by Sylvia Plath. The poem tells the story of an elderly woman's reflection in a mirror, which offers an account of the woman's life over the years. The mirror's monotonous recounting of the days and years highlights the woman's aging, and the way it speaks reflects its wisdom and experience. The woman, who has been looking in the mirror since she was young, struggles to accept her aging self and attempts to find alternate ways to view her reflection. Despite her efforts, she is unable to come to terms with growing old, and her grief at the image of herself in the mirror emphasizes her desire to hang onto her youth. These are the figurative devices used throughout the poem. Visual imagery. It is pink with speckles, line 7. We can visually picture the wall. Faces and darkness separate us over and over, line 9. We can envision the shifting of expressions, the shadows, and the brightness that create the sensation of time passing. Metaphor. In me she has drowned a young girl. The woman has been gazing into the mirror since she was young, but the passage of time has taken away her youth, and she is now elderly. Personification. I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. Line 1. The poem personifies the mirror, making it the narrator and giving it human qualities by referring to itself as a living being. These were some of the evident themes in the poem Mirror. Identity. The mirror examines the speaker's internal struggle with identity. The poem looks at how the speaker's sense of self is constantly shifting and how her identity is constantly being distorted by outside forces. Reflection. Mirror looks at how the speaker reflects on her life and relationships, and how her perception of herself is distorted by her own thoughts and feelings. Mental health. Mirror reflects the speaker's mental state, which is one of insecurity and overall instability. The next poem is Old Higue by Mark McQuart. In the poem Old Higue, Sukiant expresses her discontent with her way of life. She is unhappy that she must go out in the form of a fireball without her skin to frighten people and get baby's blood. She also expresses her pain when she has to deal with salt and count rice grains. While she has some regret of her actions, she can't resist the smell of a baby and its pure blood, as an old woman afraid of death. She explains that she serves a purpose by providing mothers with someone to blame when they wish something terrible on their children out of anger. Ultimately, she states that she will live forever as long as women have babies. These are some of the poem's figurative devices: simile, rhetorical question, repetition, and alliteration. Also, there were certain themes that were evident throughout the poem. Firstly, the Caribbean folklore. The poem draws on Caribbean folklore to explore the themes of the supernatural, power, and control. The poem also examines the cultural and religious beliefs of the Caribbean people. The supernatural. The poem revolves around a supernatural creature called Old Higue, who has the ability to transform herself into a witch. The supernatural elements of the poem are further explored through her magical powers and the fear she induces in the narrator. Fear. The poem explores themes of fear, with the mothers being fearful of the old Higue and her supernatural powers. The poem also examines how fear can cause people to act in irrational ways. Here we have the poem comparisons: Mirror versus Old Higue, similarities and differences. One of the similarities are both personas use a first person point of view and address the readers directly, making it seem as though the persona is speaking to them. One of the differences are that Mirror explores the theme of time, appearance, and the consequences of aging. On the other hand, the poem Old Higue looks at appearance versus reality, with the reality of cruelty that she has to live with. This is the end of our crash course. We hope you enjoyed.